Hey, what up, boxing fans? This is the Rope-A-Dope Radio podcast. Actually, the Rope-A-Dope Report, technically speaking. But check out the podcast at blogtalkradio.com/Rope-A-Dope Radio. You can check it out on iTunes as well. Give me a follow at Rope-A-Dope Radio. Anyway, got another live stream upload for you guys. This one's a little off topic. It's about the UFC. Getting permission, getting a bill passed. And, it's been a long time coming for the UFC to be able to, have their events in New York City. And there's some interesting details that have come out in the last couple of months and even the last couple of weeks on how exactly this happened. Now, this is not a video to sit there and rip the UFC, okay? Just right off the top, I am a casual UFC fan, although, I'm a boxing fan at heart and all that, but I like the UFC in a lot of ways. Mid-2000s to late 2000s, I really liked how their pay-per-views were stacked, right? They had, really deep cards. Obviously, that started to, kind of not be the case after a little bit. Once they got the Fox deal, I feel like that new exposure that they had, I felt like they kind of just assumed that they could throw whatever they wanted on pay-per-view. And the number of pay-per-views increased as well. I think they got up to like 16 or 17 in one year. I know they do a lot of them, but, at some points in the year, it was like every 3 weeks. You know what I mean? So I did think they kind of followed boxing too much to where they got greedy. And you could tell because the numbers of the pay-per-view on average started to go down. Obviously, the Brock Lesnar's and the GSP, and they had some popular stars, but they were having problems getting, a good average consistently. And a lot of it had to do with some of the retreads and old guys. And just when you see some main events, sometimes you look up, I work at a bar, and you look up at a commercial, and you're like, that's the main event? So it kind of turned into boxing there where you're like, all right, dude, if you're going to have them every 3 weeks or every month, they got to be stacked again. You know what I mean? And you could tell the last maybe, year and a half, 2 years, they've gotten back, especially this last chunk of time, they've gotten back to stacking their cards. And I love the idea with the prelims. I like that there's just so much basic cable content out there. And so, in a lot of ways, I really like what Dana White has done with the UFC. Okay? I'm only bringing this subject up because it's really not being talked about amongst UFC fans or boxing fans. I think a labor union for fighters is being talked about more, of course, on the MMA UFC side, right? But the Ali Act, which, of course, not a lot of people in MMA probably even know what an Ali Act is, but they don't have to go under that, but I know boxing wise, this subject as far as New York City UFC takeover, right? It hasn't really been discussed much on YouTube and not really even in print much. Luda Bella has been a big voice for this, several other promoters as well. And so, like I said, I'm not here to sit there and shit on the UFC. I'm just talking about some facts and some details. And, let's be honest. Dana White, like I said, I think he's done a very good job. The fact that they actually sold it for over $4 billion, the UFC, him and the owners, that's great for them. You know what I mean? And like I said, I've liked a lot of different things that the UFC has done and also are doing right now. Like I said, stacking the cards again, right? For pay-per-views. And even some of the prelims fights, are really, really good. So it's not, a hater, not coming from a hater angle, but the reason why I'm bringing this up because it affects boxing and it's Dana White doing what boxing does, right? Following the corruption in boxing, following certain things that boxing was able to get away with. And so I'm not even ripping him per se, like business wise. I get why he's doing some of the things I'm going to mention and why it turned out this way in New York City. But I guess my main point is it affects boxing in New York City, in New York in general, on every level. It affects a Bellator or even a smaller level, the mid-level and small club show, I guess you could say, for boxing and MMA in New York City, majorly, clearly. And it's a complete monopoly, which obviously UFC, that's what they've been about, People get mad that Al Heyman tried to have a monopoly. Oscar De La Hoya said he wants to do, a couple of years ago, several different places. He said, I want to be just like the UFC and monopolize. Don King, Bob Arum, back in the day, the mob monopolized, chunks of the sport. So here's the thing. It relates to boxing. And also it's not like Dana White hasn't, hasn't shit on boxing. And I'm not hating on it. I'm not hating that he did that. I think it's a very smart way to advertise and market your sport, especially in the first 10 years. But he does it today still. But now where it is where it is, he doesn't have to do it as much. And plus, he's not going to do it as much because he knows that he's doing some of the things that boxing, I mean, just the pay-per-view, the amount of pay-per-views, clearly there's too many. And there was a time when boxing did the same thing, when HBO got up to way too many or just not worthy of fights. We saw this year, a couple of different times, right? Just in this month alone, there's 2 pay-per-views for boxing. One of them not worth it. One of them's worth it for the fight, but I'm not really sure either guy is a big enough star to put him on pay-per-view. It's just that's the way the fight happened. So it's not being, like I said, hateful and being a hater out of nowhere. It's no secret that Dana White clearly shit on boxing. And in a lot of ways, what he was saying was completely true. I mean, there's plenty of times, plenty of complaints, plenty of corruption that has plagued the sport for years. A lot of the same issues we've had for a decade and well past that, right? So when Dana White uses it as a tool to shit on boxing over and over and over again and then follows the exact way of boxing and corruption, I'm just pointing it out. That's all I'm doing. And that's what happened in New York City. I mean, I've mentioned the amount of pay-per-views, how many there are, how they did get really weak there for a while. I think it's good that he's brought that back up. Fox isn't necessarily too happy about that because they're not getting the best fights. But hey, pay-per-view was their main model. And back when they were on Spike, most of their content, was on Spike, right? So it gave the sport really great exposure. And that's what's been lacking in boxing. And that's what I appreciate about UFC, among other things. I wrestled in high school, so I appreciate all the different, techniques and all that. But to be honest with you, a couple of things that he's doing lately are clearly the boxing blueprint. Clearly, obviously. And I think it's very impressive that he was able to build the UFC where it is today at its peak moment without having New York City in play, the biggest media market out there. That's very impressive to me. So like I said, I give Dana White a lot of credit, but there's a couple of things that stand out. Obviously, I like that they have a ranking system, but some guys it takes a lot more fights than others. There is some, when one guy controls all the ranking system in boxing, we'd hate that. And I think he's pretty good with that. We've seen some fighters get to a fair amount of fights and not get a shot for a while, right? Based off their style. I do think their style and their likability and their popularity play into their rankings somewhat. I think that's pretty basic. I think we've seen even a guy like Rashad Evans years ago, right? He had a lot of fights before he got his moment, right? But overall, they get the fights done that people want to see because they're all in the same league, and that's what I like about it as well. Now, where will they be in like 60, 70 years? So you can actually compare it to boxing nowadays in the last 25 years. We gotta remember that boxing has been a valuable commodity for well over 100 years. So you got to keep that in reference to everything. But here's another example. Okay, before I get into the takeover in New York City and how he used our government, which I think this election proves the two-party system that's ran by money, the product that you get out of the tax system and the bills that are written are obviously full of corruption, right? And this is a perfect example. And once again, I don't blame him for doing it. When I say corruption, there's some corruption, but a lot of it's legal corruption, right? It's legal to do it. It just shows you, it just shows you how crooked it is. I'll give you two examples. I mean, as far as a boxing thing goes, Conor McGregor, right? In this last fight, how he won a belt, he won a belt at 155. And he still holds a featherweight belt at, what is it, 145? And in boxing, if you hold, let's say, a welterweight belt, and you haven't fought at that weight in 3 different fights, you will get stripped. That's just the bottom line. Even Canelo, who held a middleweight belt, got stripped, right? So Dana White is clearly following the blueprint of using it as a marketing tool, right? And to me, I don't care about it because I'm used to not giving a shit about belts. And if a fight's a good fight on paper, that's all I really care about. The belts are long gone for me caring. But to be honest with you, if you're gonna say I'm gonna do the opposite of boxing all these years, and then you do exactly boxing, it just shows you. I guess I'm trying to give you an example. So McGregor goes up to 155. Obviously, there was an injury. He fought Diaz. He lost. Now they had a rematch. Another fight out of the featherweight division. That's 2 fights. And then he just fought at 155 for that division, right? For the title. Alvarez. And dominant, by the way. This has nothing to do with McGregor. It has everything to do with Dana White in packaging it. So he became the first UFC fighter to ever have to hold 2 belts at the same time, right? But obviously, that is kind of bullshit if you want to get technical. And boxing fans, by the way, if this was going on, Canelo is a prime example, they would see through that and destroy it and say, well, that's not really a record. Just like fights that are at catchweights that have a title at stake that probably shouldn't, right? I'm not saying UFC is more corrupt than boxing. I'm just saying you can't shit on boxing and then do the same thing without me talking about it. So McGregor has his third fight outside the division, and he still is a champion in that division. And there's a good chance that he won't return to 145. I'm not saying that it's for sure, you know, but there's a good chance he will just relinquish that title. There's a good chance that he'll fight Diaz next in the trilogy, which a fight I want to see. I don't care. It doesn't cheapen the title for me because I don't care about it. But if you're going to make such a big deal about it, then let's tell the truth. Let's be detailed about it. And if you have 3 fights outside of a weight class, guess what? In boxing, how corrupt and how many issues it has, you get stripped. Canelo's the biggest star in boxing right now. He got stripped. So I'm just trying to give you an example of Dana White doing the boxing blueprint marketing-wise. Clearly, he doesn't deserve to be the featherweight title anymore. Not that he wasn't the best guy at that weight. Now what he did to Aldo isn't great, but after 3 fights out of the division, he should have already been stripped. Clearly, it shouldn't be a record, but he forgot, what he was taught. Not forgot. He just marketed it. So there's an example, right? Just to give you a little example. And like I said, it has nothing to do with the accomplishments of Conor McGregor. Now, as far as it pertains, and this is all I'm going to talk about really, anymore in this video, but the New York City. Now, I believe that they should have been in New York City long ago. And I'm glad that the UFC's in New York City, right? There's a lot of fans there, a lot of population. And like I mentioned earlier, it's really impressive that they were able to get this big without being able to use that market. That's pretty damn impressive. However, how they used the market, they did it shiesty as hell. And clearly it's a monopolizing move. When they say the UFC NYC takeover, they mean it. They mean it. And I'll give you the details why. So they lobbied, and like I said, this is legal corruption. This is a product of our two-party system ran by money in our government, issues, right? So either way, when it pertains to the Ali Act in this new bill, they were able to dodge the Ali Act. Now, the new owners of the UFC are cozy with the Clintons, so they wouldn't have had the Ali Act either under them. But they did take a little bit of a gamble because Dana White was all about Donald Trump. They gave to the local governor in New York, in New York State, and they got behind Trump big time. Dana White did. So they were basically, protecting themselves no matter who won. If Clinton would have won, they would have had an issue with Bob Arum in Nevada because that's where they're based out of. That's where they have their insurance policy. So they would have had an issue when it comes to an Ali Act thing in Nevada, right? That's a good chance. That's what a lot of experts say. So, because he has some ties there. Bob Arum does, right? And he got it the same way, lobbying, right? It's the same thing. But this is how crooked and how crazy this is. The insurance policy, like I said, not a lot of boxing fans are talking about it. But if you look at New York City and New York in general, there's shows that have been going on for 5, 10, 15 straight years, right? Joe DeGuardia has been doing good in Long Island. He's been doing his thing for a while. We know Lou DiBella, in his Broadway shows that are actually locally broadcast on a cable network there, and they've been there for a long time. So, and also, a smaller club level boxing and club level MMA, and even like Bellator. This affects everybody but the UFC. And that's why it's obviously very crooked what the government did and what they were able to pull off. So, two things. When they got the bill, they wrote a new insurance policy into the bill. Now, they, like I said, they weren't able to, there was no UFC under the Ali Act thing, right? And even to this day, just a couple of days ago, Dana White was quoted on good luck when it pertains to a labor union, when it pertains to their fighters getting a labor union. He's been quoted on saying good luck with that. And it's no secret that they've been underpaying their fighters. If you look at the revenue on the gate, you look at the revenue on the pay-per-view, you look at the revenue with the Fox deal, clearly, I mean, Conor McGregor and Brock Lesnar, they just now started getting guarantees that should have been a long time ago. And I'm not talking about back-end money. I'm talking about upfront money. They were the first two to go over $1 million. And think about that. Brock Lesnar's gone over $1 million almost every time he's been out, every time he's fought. And of late, I mean, McGregor, his last 3 or 4 have been over $1 million? Clearly, they're not paying the fighter what they should be. And what the Ali Act does, I'm not going to sit there and detail it too much, but it gives the fighter information. Here's a case in point for boxing. Let's say HBO pays a fighter's promoter $1.5 million in licensing fee, right? So the fighter gets to know how much HBO gave to the promoter and how much they're getting out of that. So you get to see and know budgets of the event. Now, stars in boxing start to get to know that, and they'll get like a decent guarantee and then back end money and obviously pay-per-view money. At times you can make back end money, a lot of times you can't, sometimes you can, but it's only a couple of guys in the sport that actually can make so much money on a pay-per-view in boxing. But now, I mean, McGregor's finally getting some money on the back end, 8 and 10 and 12 and 15 million, but it's been a long time coming overall. So clearly they should be under the Ali Act because it's there to, help the fighter. And it's a combat sport, just like boxing. So there's really no reason. And now that they actually have that price tag and they have some proof of, okay, this is really how much money was paid for this, it does help them as far as lawsuits and as far as, a labor union, seeing what we should be able to get, right? And so hopefully they are able to get someplace with that. But politically, I'm not sure if they could make a dent in it, to be honest with you. But hopefully the fighters do start to get that and not just the stars. That should be for every fighter. And clearly some boxers don't even know. I mean, we just saw Chris Algieri bring it up at a press conference last year or earlier in the year saying, I don't know what I made, or he felt like he was, there was some misinformation, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, this is how skewed this new bill is. So it allowed MMA, UFC into New York, right? And the commission, the New York Commission, Athletic Commission, they're involved with this too. It's not just the governor, it's the commission, clearly, too. Now, 2 separate times, the commission in New York has dropped the ball when it comes to injuries in the ring and also just doing their job, right? And we've seen some serious, results from that, whether it's a fighter puking after a fight and them not, doing it properly, or even what's going on in the ring to an extent, and, the commission with judges and all that, there's plenty of corruption when it comes to that. But this bill was more skewed, although it was billed as, hey, we're helping out the fighters because of this new insurance hikes. It helps the UFC to monopolize New York City, in New York in general. And it helps the commission cover their ass so they don't get sued. That's the key here. And I'll tell you why. Because the insurance policy, like per fighter, went from 10,000 to 50,000, right? And then there was this extra thing written into the insurance policy. And Luda Bella and all these guys are like, hey, the fact that you jumped it from 10 to 50,000, that's great. That actually set the precedent for, that's the highest coverage in general anywhere in the whole country, probably in the whole world. That's great. There's nothing wrong with that, but there was some extra stuff that people can't afford. And it's not just the affordability, because there are some fights for boxing that are high profile enough, that have enough money behind them, that they can actually do them. They can actually do and pay. Basically, right now, if they don't get this thing fixed and make it more fair, I did read someplace that they can put a bond down, like $1 million bond. Like it costs a lot. And obviously, if you have the deep pockets that the new owners just paid over $4 billion, for, they can do anything. They can do that. And technically, this is what's so crazy. So they got this new insurance policy, right? The problem is, this is where you can tell that politics are involved. And it's clear skewed towards the UFC, because there's no insurance company that's willing to insure it. So the lawmakers, right? The two-party system ran by money that is crooked, right? They got lobbied, and they made it so the UFC takes over and monopolizes. And not just over Bellator, but over boxing too. Like I said, it's if you set a price for something to get insurance, and no one in the state will insure you, no company will step up and say, yes, I'll do it. That just shows you the corruption right there. It shows you weren't thinking about the fighters. You weren't thinking about any of this stuff, because actually you hurt the fighters, because the fighters in New York City now can't make a living in their own place. And let's be honest, like I said, Madison Square Garden maybe hasn't been that hot. Golovkin had a nice show there last year, but the Barclays has done very well and is growing and growing in the Brooklyn boxing brand. They have this new plan that they unveiled not long ago, where they have 5 different venues of bigger and smaller and mid-level stuff, to where they could really kind of build boxing there. And the Barclays has been really good since it's only been around for like 4 years for boxing. It's done really good. Think about it. They had a big heavyweight fight in January. They had a good card. It wasn't a huge crowd, but a good card in April. And then they just had Thurman Porter, which set the gate record for boxing there. It was a big crowd. Everybody loved it. We know that New York City, and especially the Barclays, has been doing really, really good for boxing. Well, right now, they had the PBC, Luda Bella, and Showtime. They had 3 different dates planned at the Barclays for the fall. And they couldn't do it because they can't find an insurance company that will even cover the price tag. So clearly, the legislators were not doing this to help the fighter, because they're taking money out of the pockets of the fighters right now. And they make good money, the commission does, from boxing, the athletic commission. So this thing is just ugly. Like, it's beyond ugly. And the kicker is, since no insurance company will cover it, the UFC didn't get insurance in New York either. But for some reason, the commission was cool with them using their insurance policy that's based in Nevada, because they feel like it's a high enough quota, or not the quota, but it's a high enough coverage that they'll be okay for now. They say they're fixing it. Before the bill passed, they talked about how, before a bill gets passed, the government will go through the motions and say, yeah, come on in. We're going to have a big talk about it. You come talk and say your side. This happens in small businesses all the time, in mid-level businesses. But the top corporations, as we know, the top 1%, that's who wins out because they lobbied. They got the money to fight it in court anyway. So they listen to Lou DiBella. They listen to DeGardi. They listen to Heather Hardy, who's a very popular and ever-growing women's boxer who's got a nice fan base going, who now actually is going to MMA because she can't make a living right now in New York City, which is crazy. So, I mean, you got like Danny Garcia. You got a couple of guys there that have, Porter and Thurman can definitely go fight there again after that performance. Big heavyweight fight with Spilka and Wilder. Wilder was going to say, I'm fighting at home in Alabama or the Barclays. That's where he was going to do his thing. Obviously, he was going to have to go to Russia too, right, to fight Povetkin. But it just shows you how corrupt something is. And supposedly they're working it out. And I think in the long run, they're going to work it out. But in the meantime, you lose momentum. Combat sports, everything, marketing, all that is about momentum. And the 3 shows that they had at Barclays and some of the ones they've had in the past, it's really, it's one of the hottest venues there is and one of the most active venues there is in the country. So it's just on some bullshit. And like I said, Dana White, I understand he's doing what he's supposed to do to protect his asset. So I'm not blaming Dana White here, but let's call a spade, though. This is clearly corruption inside the government, which is nothing new. So I assume it's going to get fixed because how long can you go where you put a bill out and no insurance company was willing to step up and do it? You know what I mean? But in the meantime, there goes 2 or 3 shows that could have been in Barclays for boxing. And this, like I said, Bellator gets affected by this too. People don't have the deep pockets to put up some multi-million-dollar bond to do a show. Now, there's some fights in boxing that they can do. In fact, Lou DiBella, the first part of, if you're interested in this topic, Lou DiBella, if you watch the James DeGale Badu Jack press conference that they had yesterday, he really, and a couple other people as well, really detail some of this. If you've heard Lou talk about this before, it's obviously some corruption here. This is ridiculous. And it affects boxing majorly in a market boxing badly needs and actually was doing the right thing. They were developing it. Like I said, the Brooklyn boxing brand has 5 different venues. There's a new arena opening in April. The Coliseum, it's got remodeled, refurbished, and they have an arena, a full arena, and they also have a theater, much like the Madison Square Garden Theater. So it's a smaller venue there and a bigger venue. And then they have some mid-level stuff, one in Manhattan, one in Brooklyn. So they were going to have 5 different venues because obviously the Barclays is a busy place. The Barclays is not always open. And some of the shows are, you don't bring everything to a big arena. The theater at this new arena, Long Island in general has so much population that they know that new arena in general for whatever concerts and all that is going to be big because people in Long Island are like, hey, dude, I don't have to go anywhere. We got an arena here where concerts will come and this, So it's crazy, man. I really hope it gets fixed because, like I said, boxing was really starting to pop in New York City, and it'd be a real shame, man. It'd be a sad thing for the sport where it actually is doing something pretty good and it has plenty of corruption, clearly. But it's one thing to monopolize your industry, but this is ridiculous. So hopefully that gets fixed. Anyway, I'm done with my rant, just giving you a little bit more detail on how corrupt this is. But they're gambling with a January 14th card with DeGale and Badu Jack. The undercard is a pretty good fight, too. Davis, who's undefeated, is a huge step up for him against Pedraza. They're just saying, screw it. We're having one January. They're trying to put pressure on the commission and on the government to go, what the hell is this? You got to fix this. We need to fix this. So anyway, just something to think about as boxing fans, man. I really hope it gets fixed. Anyway, make sure you check out the Rope-A-Dope Radio podcast. It's live every Wednesday, but you can check out anytime on iTunes. Subscribe, do your thing there, or else blogtalkradio.com/Rope-A-Dope Radio. I'm out of here, guys. Peace.